Today we have three fantastic scholars with us. I'm going to say their name and then they're going to introduce themselves so that they pop up. You see them when they talk rather than me. So first we have Dr. Jan John Mcmanus from Missouri University of Science and Technology. John, would you like to say a word about yourself?
I am a Curator's Distinguished Professor, U.S. Military History at the Missouri S&T, and I've written a number of books, but specifically two books that have focused on D-Day, another one on Normandy. My most recent book on the topic is called The Dead and Those About to Die, the Big Red One in Omaha Beach.
We also have Tim Rives with us today. He is the Deputy Director and Supervisory Archivist for the Eisenhower Presidential Library. He is also our content expert. Tim, why don't you tell him about yourself?
Well, as Don says, I'm with the Eisenhower Library and Museum. I've been here about 12 years. I came out here from the National Archives in Kansas City. It's been a great experience, especially getting to work with historians and researchers like Dr. McManus, who's put in a lot of time in the research room here at Abilene. Grew up in Kansas, went to Wichita State and Emporia State, spent 5 years in the Army in between, and I'm really looking forward to today's discussion.
And last but not least, we have Dr. Ed Lengel. Dr. Ed Lengel works for the National Archives, no, not the National Archives. I've done that twice in my head already. I've changed your job, I'm sorry. He actually works for the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, and he will be our moderator today. So Dr. Lengel, after you introduce yourself, maybe you could just hop into the program.
Absolutely. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ed Lengel. I'm Senior Director of Programs at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. I've only been there since last October. I've spent much of my career writing about other wars. I have several books about America's participation in the First World War and the Meuse-Argonne campaign, the Lost Battalion recently. I've also written quite a bit about George Washington, but I'm a military historian. I've been interested in World War II all of my life, and most recently last year I led a number of tours to the Normandy battlefields. I was honored to be there for the 75th anniversary, which was quite an experience. And walking down Omaha Beach, the guide which I held in my hand literally as we walked, and using the maps from that as well, was John Mcmanus' excellent book, The Dead and Those About to Die. For those of you who haven't read it yet, I highly encourage you to take a look. It's really a fantastic book. So it's my honor to join all of you this afternoon for what I'm sure is going to be an awesome program. I will go right into the first part of the program with my friend John Mcmanus. And John, I know your intention here is to give us kind of a broad overview of the D-Day campaign and Eisenhower's role in it.
Sorry, I'm having a lot of technical problems here. I apologize.
Well, maybe the thing to do is for Tim to begin on his part of the presentation. If you're ready to do that, Tim.
Let's do it. We'll be concentrating on, I think, what many of us here consider, I know I do personally, our #1 document. We have 26 million pages of documents at the Eisenhower Library. And I think the in case of failure note, as we call it, which is, as we'll see, is a note that Ike wrote the night before the invasion started, I think is the crown jewel of our holdings. And so I'm pleased to be able to share it with you today, and some thoughts on it and how we take care of it here at the library and how it came down to us through history. And as I was thinking this week about these famous words, and words that I think should be better known, I think Eisenhower's in case of failure note should be better known to Americans. I was thinking about other famous words and statements made by Eisenhower around D-Day, and there's several, and there's some that are known, some that are debatable, and then one which was unused, which is the one we'll ultimately talk about. But one in particular is called the Order of the Day, and it was a letter that Ike wrote to all the Allied troops that was given to them the day before the invasion and read aboard ships the day before the invasion. They'd recorded it on May 28th, I discovered from our records. And I know we have that queued up to where we can listen to it in Ike's own words. So you'll be able to hear what all the men and women of the Allied Expeditionary Force heard before going into this great battle. Troy, if you're ready to roll.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened. He will fight savagely. But this is the year 1944. Much has happened since the Nazi triumphs of 1940-41. The United Nations have inflicted upon the Germans great defeats in open battle, man to man. Our air offensive has seriously reduced their strength in the air and their capacity to wage war on the ground. Our home fronts have given us an overwhelming superiority in weapons and munitions of war, and placed at our disposal great reserves of trained fighting men. The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking.
Another great documentary record in the archives is Ike's draft of the order of the day, which you can now see on the screen. These are from the papers of General Ray Barker. Ray Barker was one of the D-Day planners on the very influential in the invasion becoming what it is. And you can see several comments by Ike, one of which down at the bottom he says, "Find, bring back to me." And I don't know if he just meant to bring that to his office so that he could have it for future reference, or so that he could send it one day to his library. But I'm sure glad that he had it returned to himself. But again, this is another one of those great D-Day documents that we have in the library. Another item related to the war is called Communique Number 1. And this was issued by SHAEF, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force that I commanded. As soon as they launched the invasion, they released this press release. You can see, under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces supported by strong air forces began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. Pretty straightforward and to the point. This comes to us from the papers of a guy named Thor Smith, who was one of the public relations officers that worked with Eisenhower. Another great documentary artifact is called, there's a message to the people, the liberated peoples of Europe, which I recorded the same day that he did the order of the day, and it's within the Library of Congress's vault of the most important recordings of the 20th century, so you can hear it there. There are also words associated with D-Day that are debatable. And this is just a little bit off topic, but it's kind of interesting, so I thought we'd touch upon it. And a few years ago, I decided to try to track down what Eisenhower's final words were when he made the final decision on the morning of June 5th, 1944, that they would launch the invasion. They'd met the evening of June 4th at 9:30 p.m., and they thought the weather was good enough they could go, but Eisenhower said, "Let's meet again in a few hours and we'll make it official." And so with the time difference, we're probably almost exactly 76 years to the date for that meeting on the evening of June 4th, which is interesting to ponder. But I came back in, met with his commanders the next morning and said, "Okay, we're going." But neither Ike nor any of the eyewitnesses can agree on exactly what he said when he put this massive invasion into movement. And it's just always kind of struck me that here you have this great historic moment, but you don't have words to mark it like "I shall return" or "damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." And so all these accounts you can see on the screen were from eyewitnesses. 5 of them were from Eisenhower. And almost every time he talked about what he said when he launched the invasion, he used a different expression. And I know some of you can't see this, so I'll read quickly. Did he say, well, we'll go. We will sail tomorrow. Okay, boys, we will go. Okay, let her rip. All right, we move. Gentlemen, we will go ahead as planned, et cetera, et cetera. So they're not all just a little different. Some of them are vastly different. But it's interesting that here you had all these eyewitnesses, including the man who spoke the words for such a auspicious moment, but nobody can agree on exactly what he said. And then there are the unused words, which we'll talk about today. And this comes to us in the form of what we call the in case of failure note, which Eisenhower and some of his staff referred to as the unused communique. You can see it there on the screen, most of you, but again, I'll read it for those of you who are on the phone. Eisenhower simply wrote, our landings in the Cherbourg Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold. I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. And I think the reason this is so, to me, so important, not just as a D-Day artifact, but also for what it tells us about Dwight Eisenhower. And he's not saying, he's not writing some CYA memo the night before the invasion saying if this thing, is unsuccessful, we're going to form a blue ribbon commission and see if we can determine where the system broke down. Instead, he very simply, thanks the troops who are involved, the Navy and the air, and then takes personal responsibility for the outcome of the invasion. Just in a very simple, straightforward way, just the way that Eisenhower was known to be. And I think, again, coupled with the event, with what it tells us about Eisenhower's character, to me, that's why it's the most important item that we have in the Eisenhower Library. Well, it comes down to us through history by way of the Butcher Diary. And Captain Harry Butcher was Ike's naval aide. And why did an Army officer need a naval aide? You might reasonably ask yourselves. Well, he probably didn't, but Ike knew that even from the very beginning of his command in the European Theater of Operations in late June of 1942, that he would need sort of a pal, a confidant, someone to play bridge with, someone to golf with, someone, as he said, to help keep him sane. And so he went to Admiral Ernest King, and asked for a naval aide, which he also thought would symbolize a unity of command of all the armed forces working jointly in the enterprise. And they said he could, and so he selected Harry Butcher, whom he had actually known since the late 1920s. In fact, Harry Butcher was friends with Milton Eisenhower. Milton Eisenhower was Ike's youngest brother. He worked for the Department of Agriculture in Washington, and they had some mutual friends, and that's when they first became acquainted. Butcher was an executive with CBS Radio in Washington, D.C., and he was just turned out to be a perfect fit for this job. For posterity's sake, I'm not just being Ike's kind of all-purpose staff officer. Ike asked him to keep a diary. Butcher wrote, quote, I'm quoting here, he, meaning Ike, had in mind that it would be principally a catalog showing dates, places, and reminders of interesting events. It would also be one that Ike knew he could use in part later when he would write his own memoirs. He did, and it was published in 1948. It's a great record. It's not only kind of this catalog that he had envisioned of people, places, and dates, but also, some good personal observations, also some kind of gossipy things too that would come back to haunt him. It became a bestseller for Butcher, but a bit of a source of embarrassment for Ike because of some really sort of minor indiscretions, but one of which would prove really embarrassing were Butcher including accounts of Ike mimicking Winston Churchill as Churchill slurped his soup. And it was not, the most respectful portrayal, I guess you could say. Churchill responded with a letter to Ike in a way that only Churchill can, which is, of course, very memorable. That letter is dated July 26, 1946. Again, something that we have in the library, and I'll lead you. It was a 3-page letter. I'll read you just one paragraph because it's so good. And this is Churchill writing, Ike talking about the book. He says, "I have skimmed over the Butcher articles, and I think you have been ill-used by your confidential aide. The articles are, in my opinion, altogether below the level upon which such matters should be treated. Great events and personalities are made small when passed through the medium of this small mind. Few people have played about with so much dynamite and made so little of it." So that was Churchill's criticism of the book. Well, Butcher gave the originals to Ike, and Ike then sent them to the library. The note was found just taped to page 1488 in the binders that came. And I know this is not a great visual, but that is an image there, Troy, that we have, I think next one actually after this, of just the blank page where it was, you know, taped into this diary. And I wish I could have been the archivist who had that eureka moment of finding this historic note taped into this book, this loose leaf binder of these pages that Commander Captain Butcher dictated. And now, Troy, if you can go back one, he didn't actually write about it. Sometimes his writing would lag for a few days or even weeks, because during the war, as Butcher kept the diary. And he doesn't talk about it until July 11th, 1944. And he writes, "This afternoon, Ike called me into his office and handed me a sheet of notepaper on which he had scribbled a message. He said he had found it in his wallet. After reading it, I told him I wanted it for the diary. He reluctantly assented, saying that he had written one in similar vein for every amphibious operation, but had secretly torn up each one. If I put this one in the diary, it might be bad luck. I apparently argued him out of an ill omen." End of quote. Now the note, I don't know if we want to go back, Troy, to where we can see it. The "in case of failure" message is mysteriously dated. You can see there at the bottom of the page, July 5th. Why? Well, my thought for many years was just that, I mean, here Ike was under so much stress, under so much pressure, that it was just that which made the confusion in his mind. And so I just chalked it up to stress, but I began to doubt that when I watched this great CBS documentary called D-Day +20 that aired in the United States on June 6, 1964 for the 20th anniversary of D-Day. It was actually filmed in August of '63. But Eisenhower's with Walter Cronkite, who hosted it, and they're at Suffolk House in the room where Ike actually made the final call to launch the invasion. And Ike's talking about the events, and he says July 5th, I mean June 5th. So I thought, well, maybe this is just some kind of verbal hiccup that Ike has, that he would, you know, sometimes confuse May or June and July, not May and June. But I talked to someone recently who has a book coming out about Eisenhower, and she thinks that July 5th is the date that perhaps he rediscovered it in his wallet and sort of confirmed that it was the original on that date before giving it to Butcher, that then Butcher did not record it in his diary till July 11th. I don't know, but it is a bit of a mystery that this famous D-Day note is dated July 5th. Someday, perhaps, maybe we'll find out. But while reviewing internal records at the library, I did discover that it arrived in 1968, so we've had it now about 52 years. It's small. It's only about 4 inches by 6 inches, so it's actually a little bigger than it might appear on your screen if you could see it. And it's yellow. And it's yellow because of a naturally occurring chemical in wood called lignin, which is acid, and it's what same thing that turns newspapers yellow, turns old paperback novels yellow, that kind of thing. And so the National Archives needed to find some way to conserve it, and so they were able to neutralize this acid by putting a new backing on that piece of paper to buffer the acid and to keep it from migrating. Without that sort of treatment, this would literally disintegrate and turn to dust. With this treatment, with the climate controls that we have in the archives, we keep the archive stacks at about 60 degrees and about 40% humidity. Paper in these kinds of conditions, will last many hundreds of years. under the right conditions. And so it has been stabilized so that our descendants and future generations can see it and take the same kind of inspiration from it that I do. But again, I think it's our number one item in the library. It's something we rarely, again, because of conservation, we don't have on exhibit very often. The less things, the things are exposed to light, the better. And so in case of failure message, the unused communique is usually safely tucked away in the archive stacks. I think that's about all I have at the moment, Ed. If we want to bring this back in the discussion later, but
Tim, this is such a great document. It's a real treasure, and I often think of it in the context of Ike's character. You know, what type of leader that he was, what type of man that he was, and I kind of had a little bit of an aha moment and insight when I read this book that came out, I think it was last year, by Will Hitchcock called The Age of Eisenhower. It's a great book. It discusses Eisenhower's presidency, although it also covers other parts of his career. And it's interesting, toward the end of his presidency, there's a similar moment in some ways. Many of you are familiar, I'm sure, with the Garriepowers U-2 spy plane incident, where Garriepowers, the American pilot, pilots this U-2 over the Soviet Union to take photographs of Soviet missile installations. The U-2 is shot down, and Eisenhower thinks at first that, as they assumed, that Powers would have been killed, because that was the instructions. You know, you're not supposed to be captured. And the Soviets keep his capture secret, and only later, after Eisenhower somewhat embarrassed himself, do they reveal they've actually got Powers in custody. The interesting backdrop to that is that it really wasn't Ike's fault. Ike had been opposed to sending the U-2 over the Soviet Union for quite some time. He had resisted it for a long time. He suspected that the Soviets had developed the technology to be able to shoot these things down. He was afraid of just this sort of incident. He didn't think it was necessary, but he was under so much political pressure, including from his own advisors, just saying, we really, really need this information. They essentially pushed him into doing it. And so, you know, a human response to that, I didn't want to do this, it really isn't my fault. I was pressured into doing it. But Eisenhower, characteristically, he says, I take full responsibility. There's nobody else to blame here except me, me, President Eisenhower. So, you know, that's very much in keeping with his character as a leader.
Yeah, it is. And here we just have this great testament. And I remember reading also, I think this was also the Butcher Diary, and it's during the Anzio campaign, which had really bogged down and turned into the kind of nightmare that Allied planners feared could also happen at Normandy, when the troops were almost locked up at the beach in a almost trench warfare reminiscent of World War I in some cases. And one reporter's frustration at no one wanting to take responsibility. And he said, you know, if Eisenhower were still in the Mediterranean, he would step up and take responsibility for this. So I think it is something that was recognized by Ike's contemporaries and now, you know, by historians as well. So it really is a great mark of his character.
If we put it too into the context of his leadership in the European theater of operations in World War II, I'll just run ahead with this while we're waiting for John Mcmanus to get back with us. Think about Eisenhower's background. As many of you know already, Eisenhower had no combat experience at all. Now, here's a man who, during the First World War, had been posted at Camp Colt, a place near Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, which you can still go and see the area where that was. It's not too far from the battlefields, and he was involved with George Patton in setting up the U.S. Army Tank Corps. Now, Patton got to, once they finally got some tanks, they were French-built tanks, Patton got to accompany those tanks over to Europe and fight in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, and Eisenhower, much to his disgust, had to stay stateside. He then, in between the wars, takes more or less the course of a career military officer. He goes to Europe on assignment to investigate and write the guide to the American World War I battlefields, and then serves as an aide to General Douglas MacArthur. And so think about this in terms of the types of people he had encountered. Some of the outstanding personalities, military personalities of our age. First, he has to work with George Patton. Then he has to work with Douglas MacArthur as their subordinates. And talk about egos that he has to work with under MacArthur. And then in World War II, the assumption for many people was that George C. Marshall would be the man to command the invasion forces, and in some way Eisenhower is lifted up to this realm of authority and command of SHAEF that he had no way of anticipating. But one thing that he knew extremely well was how to handle and how to navigate personalities.
Yeah.
When I led the D-Day tours that I did last year, I asked my guests to think about yourself. Imagine yourself in a, if not in a military situation, imagine yourself in a work situation where you have to deal with egos of the likes of Franklin D. Roosevelt, of Winston Churchill, of George Patton, of Bernard Law Montgomery, who had probably the largest ego in the Western Hemisphere. To say, probably the only man who could rival him, Eisenhower also had to deal with, and that was Charles de Gaulle. So he's dealing with all of these personalities. He has to navigate this. He has to, in his negotiations with Churchill, as you discussed, he has to balance the pressure that the British are placing him under to focus on the Mediterranean theater, to maintain efforts there from North Africa to Italy, and then in what Churchill called the soft underbelly of Europe. And then on the other hand, FDR and people like George C. Marshall, who are ready to launch a cross-channel invasion of France in 1942. So he's balancing all of these things. The man is smoking, I can't remember how much, 4 or 5 packs a day of cigarettes. He's under tremendous stress. And imagine that, looking at this note, it demonstrates that all through this time, Eisenhower accepts and takes upon himself full responsibility. And that's something that in the context of military history, those of you who study it or you've experienced it in the military, you know the temptation of many senior officers when things get tough is to try to shift the blame, to try to say, well, I'm not really responsible for this. It's happened over and over and over again. I'm not responsible. Somebody else is responsible. I'll do what I can. I'll take responsibility if things turn out well. But if they don't, I'm going to shift it elsewhere. And often it's the field officers, the officers on the spot, who have to take on that responsibility. But here's a shining leadership example. I think that is totally relevant today and will always be relevant, of a man who was able to carry this really heavy burden on himself, carry this responsibility, and be completely honest and forthright about it. It really is remarkable. And do you get that same feeling, Tim, when you look at the document? Do you have that kind of sense of his character?
Absolutely. And I think, again, that's why it's just such a great artifact of the moment and the man. And I think that list of, what did Ike say when he launched the invasion, I think that speaks to his character too. I mean, Ike really was humble, a humble guy from the heart of America. I'm sure he could have had the OWI, the Office of War Information, or the SHAEF PR people, someone craft a statement saying this is what President Eisenhower said when he made the final decision to launch the invasion on June 5th. I don't think he ever would have gone for that. I shall return was crafted for MacArthur, although I believe he was supposed to say we shall return, but of course it became I shall return. But Eisenhower had a dislike. I mean, there's a note to the publisher, a letter to the publisher, Henry Luce, and I talked about how much he disliked desk pounders and slick talkers. He did not like that kind of histrionic personality, and joked to his son, John, who verified this for me a number of years ago, John Eisenhower, that his father really did say he studied dramatics under Douglas MacArthur. But again, that humble personality, he didn't think that you should blow out of proportion the words that he used, to launch the invasion. I think that's one reason you have so many different accounts. The fog of war is probably the other. But again, this note just so neatly captures and represents what he was about as a person and a commander, that I can't think of a more important one for those of us who study the life of Dwight Eisenhower and the times that he lived in than this one. So we're, again, thrilled to have it and to share with everybody.
So I apologize if there's anything I bring up that Tim and Ed, if you guys have talked about, but one of the points I wanted to make beyond the consequences for Eisenhower personally and his leadership is, the stakes and consequences of failure on D-Day. If the invasion fails, I think you're looking at the probability that the Allies aren't going to be back for at least another year, if ever. Another issue is the political side. Churchill's government was really just an emergency war cabinet in which he was presiding minister. And, there's no guarantee he would have survived a colossal failure. And so who knows, maybe it's a different kind of British government with different policy in relation to the war in Europe, at least. And I think sometimes as Americans, we tend to overlook 1944 was an election year. And, it's quite possible Roosevelt might not have won. Maybe the Germany First policy, would have changed. I mean, who knows? The Germans and the Soviets could have concluded a separate peace. That's something the Allies had worried about earlier in the war. On the other hand, the Soviets might have, quote, liberated the rest of Europe. In other words, a communist Europe, leaving the Western Allies on the environs there. I think it's for sure that the sweeping genocide of Jews and other peoples in Europe that we tend to call the Holocaust would have been significantly worse, if only because the perpetrators would have had a heck of a lot more time and resources to do their grisly work. And also the Germans probably would have had more time to develop the rocket technology, the jet aircraft, the snorkel submarines that eventually came into play, but too late to have any kind of major impact on the war. So for Eisenhower, the consequences were enormous, beyond even just his own personal leadership and career.
And what too, John, would have been the consequences if Eisenhower had decided not to go on June 6th and to delay the invasion?
Yeah, well then you would have run into problems on the other side. First of all, operational security would have been a serious issue. I mean, you have hundreds of thousands of young soldiers, sailors, and airmen, who had been briefed, and especially the assault troops who had been briefed and knew when and where the invasion was supposed to happen, and it would have been difficult to keep that secret, much less the diplomatic side of diplomatic communications of neutrals in England and things like that. But let's say that the invasion gets postponed to the window that they had planned as a secondary window. Well, that's the June 17th, 18th period. And of course, as we know in hindsight, that's when a massive storm came through the channel. It was probably the worst storm they'd had in about 50 years. So they would have had to cancel it again or postpone it again. And so now we're looking at July. And then, at that stage, the Germans have had a lot more chances to recover from whatever's happening on the Eastern Front, or have been bludgeoned by the Soviets in such a way that you're going to have a different power dynamic by the time the Western Allies do get ashore. Yeah, on a lot of different sides of this, there were major consequences.
John, how important was Ike's ability to work with the British? I think one of the most interesting anecdotes, and I think this was during the Operation Torch campaign, that in the late 1942, that Eisenhower said, if I hear any of my officers calling their fellow officer a son of a bitch, I've got no problem with that. But if I hear him calling him a British son of a bitch, then I'm going to deal with it personally and get that officer out of there. So, that was something very difficult for him to navigate. Obviously, D-Day was an Anglo-American and Canadian operation. Not easy to coordinate.
Absolutely. And I think Eisenhower's genius in this sense was understanding that the American future was alongside allies. And of course, he had learned that lesson vividly in World War I, not from necessarily participating in combat, but seeing how the war was fought. The last major war we fought without any allies is the Spanish-American War. So I think Eisenhower understood, of course, his own present, but what the American future would be. And he understood what defeating Germany would take, that no one country in the Western Alliance really had enough power to defeat Germany with any kind of acceptable losses, you might say, I guess. Eisenhower from the beginning in 1942 is trying to establish a kind of multinational team in which officers and others are going to think less of what country they come from and a little bit more about their common objective, what has actually brought them together.
What about motivating the men? We were speaking a little bit earlier, the fact that Eisenhower had not experienced combat, and the men who fought for him, from staff officers right down to the lowliest privates on the line, they knew that their leader, Dwight D. Eisenhower, had never seen combat. And for any officer attempting to motivate men who are going to have to risk their lives, and knowing that Eisenhower, is not going to be in the line of fire, he's never been in the line of fire, that's a tall order. And yet he had the ability, through his either the famous photos of his going down to greet the paratroopers just before they take off for deployment in the Cherbourg Peninsula, that he's chatting with them. He was able to make that leap, and he was able to come across as genuine. The men trusted him. The men were willing to go under fire for him. How did he do that?
I think he does it by his obvious rapport and his obvious empathy for the average soldier. Certainly the famous visit to the 502nd Parachute Infantry is our prime example of that. But we have a lot of examples of him from North Africa onward, just sort of visiting and relating with the average soldier, regardless of country. And I think that's a big part of this. And I think he has enough military acumen and proficiency in terms of the schooling that he's had, like the Army War College, the Command and General Staff College, and so on and so forth, to establish his professional bona fides. But I do think it's a little bit of an Achilles heel for him throughout the war, with some of his key combat-oriented generals, Montgomery being the best example. In many cases, they're like, well, Eisenhower, I'll take your advice when it comes to the sort of strategic and political side, but I don't see you as a tactical combat commander. You see this sort of mix up in Market Garden and in the Battle of the Bulge. And so on D-Day, I don't think that's as big a factor because, they've all worked together so carefully and coordinated so much on this thing. And there's no doubt that there isn't going to be any general who's leading the way ashore at the stature of Montgomery and above. But I think as the war grinds on, and when I compare him with other American theater commanders, this is more of a challenge for him. I mean, there were many times that MacArthur went into harm's way as a theater commander, and Joseph Stilwell would be another example in China, Burma, and India. Eisenhower is a unique circumstance, and I think overall he handled it well.
Yeah. He was able to carry it off without bluster, which is really remarkable. I think that also the man on the ground understood what Eisenhower's job was. They didn't expect him to be there showing off. They didn't expect him to pretend that he was somebody he wasn't. they expected him to do his job, which was to coordinate everything to give them the tools that they needed in order to achieve victory. So it shows a man with a real understanding of what his role is, and the right man for the moment.
Absolutely. And the other thing too, from a kind of an American point of view, something that really resonates with the American soldier. Eisenhower puts on no airs. And he comes from a very humble background, like many of the guys who were part of his army. And so he just kind of had this ability, to establish rapport with people. He didn't seem to be some sort of emperor figure. He was, a guy like them who just happened to be a military professional. And I think that's a really good point, Ed, that, he's the exact man for this moment.
Well, I could ask plenty more questions, but I think we're around at the time where we'd like to open it up to our guests to ask any questions they may have, whether myself, John, or Tim, or observations or thoughts.
Great.
Thank you, Dr. Lengel. I was going to recommend that as well. This is Dawn again. I didn't turn my camera on. We have the chat feature at the top of the screen if you would like to just text in a question. Otherwise, you're going to need to unmute, which might be *6 for you, or the mute button at the bottom of your screen. And don't forget to tell us where you're from in the chat section. So any questions?
I'm certainly happy to jump in with one more, John. Do we know what the Germans thought of Eisenhower?
Yeah, the Germans have a kind of mixed feeling about Eisenhower. They certainly would deride his lack of combat experience. They are mystified at times of some of the approaches or decisions that he makes. An example would be Hurtgen Forest in November, December 1944. But I think overall, there's a sense among certainly the German strategic leaders that this is a pretty formidable adversary because he can hold the Western coalition together so well. And, once that happens, Germany's in a very serious situation because, obviously they don't have the right quotient on their side in terms of manpower and firepower and economic power. And so when you combine the Soviets with that, and that's another thing we don't talk about that much, but Eisenhower actually worked pretty well with the Soviets, so much as that came into play. That tended to be towards the end of the war, but also transitioning to the occupation. Eisenhower got along exceptionally well with Zhukov, the leading Soviet commander. So I think the overall German point of view is this is a formidable guy, but not necessarily a combat person.
This is Dawn. I have a question. Brett, you first.
Sorry. This is Brett Weeks from Solomon, Kansas. Let me preface my questions by saying, I'm a big fan of Eisenhower. I'm impressed by him in many ways. But, I don't want to, rain on the parade a little bit, but, in looking at what happened at Normandy, the Allied planners knew that Omaha Beach was the linchpin of the operation. If Omaha Beach failed, the whole operation would fail, basically, because it was right in the middle of the whole landing area. But yet, when you look at what actually happened at Omaha, everything went wrong. Naval gunfire, air support, the airborne landings, were a big, the 101st and the 82nd were scattered all over the place. Mike, as it relates to Eisenhower, I guess I'm wondering, was he too much hands off? Did he let his subordinate commanders and planners, did he not supervise them, or did he not, look at what they were doing and to make sure that, that things were done right or planned well enough, because he was deferring to them too much?
I'd be glad to take that and share a few thoughts. I think there are times in the war when Eisenhower is too distant and some bad things eventuate from that. And I think really the prime example is not D-Day, but sort of towards the end of the Battle of Normandy, and as you get into the early part of the fall in 1944, Eisenhower's headquarters was in western Normandy at that point, quite remote from where the front lines were, near Belgium and Holland and the German frontier, communications had almost regressed to pre-World War I standards because Eisenhower's telephone lines were not reliable. He didn't have radio connection with his commanders. And so I do think there was some confusion that came from that. And this is one of the reasons why the supply situation is so problematic, but also why there isn't a kind of coordinated effort of how the Allies are going to go about trying to administer the knockout blow to Germany. So I do think we can find times when he probably could have had a better hands-on leadership. But also at other times when he did, such as the Battle of the Bulge, he had pushback from Montgomery, and there was tension that came from that too.
We got a write-in question from Mr. Older. He writes, the Allies sent in 13,000 airplanes to punch a hole in the German defenses after a month of stalemate. Why didn't the Allies use air power more on D-Day?
Oh, they do. They use quite a bit of it. They use massive amounts of air power. It just wasn't particularly effective for getting the troops ashore. Famously, of course, at Omaha Beach, when you've got 4-engine bombers from the 8th Air Force that have been tasked with bombing a target window inside of about 1,000 meters, which is really just not to their capability. And of course, as we know, the weather wasn't that good, so visibility wasn't that good, and the bombing was quite ineffective. But you can find other times, like at Utah Beach, where the medium bombers flying very low did some serious damage. And I think we tend to overlook the role of the fighter planes that are absolutely savaging German movements on D-Day and helping isolate the battlefield, which Eisenhower felt was imperative for the success of the invasion, and certainly he was correct. But so that's one part of the answer to your question. The second part is that the aerial commanders didn't necessarily want to get too heavily involved in the support of tactical operations. Now, they were going to do that as long as the agreement lasted for Eisenhower to control the air forces, which had been the case since April. But there was a closing window on that. They wanted to get back to bombing targets in Germany.
Dr. Lengel or Tim, do you have anything to add?
So there are a number of cases, especially later on in the campaign, of friendly fire incidents where American and British flyers accidentally hit their own troops. And that's tragic, but for the most part, the flyers were extremely nervous, practically to the point of paranoia about hitting their own troops. And that did play some role on D-Day, as I understand. John, correct me if I'm wrong. The bombers, fighter bombers, and others that came in over Omaha were flying perpendicular to the beach and were terrified that they would hit, the wrong targets, and they tended to drop their bombs too late, so that their bombs fell too far inland. And that Utah, they flew parallel to the beach just because of the geography. So even though sometimes they'd wait too long to drop their bombs, they would still hit something. Is there truth to that? I think that's what I've read.
No, absolutely. Yeah. And one of the things that is decisive at Utah Beach is the use of medium bombers, which flew and bombed at a lower altitude and thus really more accurate. Now that was a successful part of that mission, but the other thing, we were talking about the airborne earlier, how scattered they were. And one of the reasons for that is the failure of the bombers to eliminate a lot of the anti-aircraft positions that the Germans had on the Khotan-10 Peninsula. And so the consequence of that, of course, is that you have all these anti-aircraft positions, these flak guns that are trying to shoot up, very vulnerable C-47s that don't have self-sealing fuel tanks. And, any sane human being is going to try and evade that. And so you end up with a lot of scattered drops to a great extent because of that. So the results of the Air Force's side of the invasion are kind of mixed.
We got another question from, I'm sorry, Tim, did you want to say something? I apologize.
No, go right ahead, please.
Okay, we have 3 questions lined up. So we have a question from Salam David. Is it David or David? I'm from Louisiana. I pronounce things oddly. And he is asking about the crickets that the airborne jumpers used. He says, how and who thought of this simple device, and was it a success or a failure?
The crickets tended to be employed more often by the rookie airborne units, the 101st most notably, but they thought of it, just as a kind of early warning mechanism, even in the 82nd Airborne Division, as they were looking at some of their kind of after action reviews from the Sicily drop, which was, pretty problematic and scattered, sort of like Normandy. They also wondered, how we can have recognition, in the darkness and in a hostile place. And so what's interesting about the crickets is that it's done a little bit more haphazardly than systematically, as we tend to think of it all these years later. It's a very colorful part of D-Day, but I will tell you that the average airborne trooper probably had no experience with a cricket during the darkness before the sun rose on D-Day. So a little of that has gone a long way, because it's kind of a neat thing, kind of a neat little system they came up with, but not that many of them had occasion to use it, believe it or not.
All right, we have another question from Dave Miners about the bocage. He writes, the hedgerows cost hundreds of Allied lives. No one anticipated this?
It was anticipated in that the D-Day planners, both British and American, understood the internal geography. They knew that they were going to have to fight through the hedgerows and the bocage. That was one of the disadvantages of Normandy, one of the things that made the Pas de Calais attractive for a while, or even potentially landing further south toward Boulogne, is that the internal topography there is more flat, more open, and more effective for deploying tanks. And tanks were going to be extremely important to the Allied strategy on pushing inland. They didn't anticipate just how awful it would be. There was a hope that they'd be able to push inland more quickly, that they'd be able to push beyond much of the bocage more quickly. But also you have to remember the enemy has a vote. The Germans were masters of infantry tactics and improvisation, and they were able, kind of on the ground, to use the bocage and the hedgerows in ways that even the Allied planners had been unable to anticipate. Now, the argument has been made, and John, do elaborate on this if you like, that in some ways the Germans' use of the bocage was in the long term disadvantageous to them as well, because it kind of locked them in place, and that they ended up taking heavier casualties perhaps than they would have initially. But that's my thought on it. John or Tim, any thoughts?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Just 100%. Just to build on that a little bit, the Germans are in a dilemma, because if they all can maneuver and leave the hedgerows really good defensible ground, leave them undefended, well, then they're going to be vulnerable to Allied air. Anytime you look at when some of their mechanized formations are on the move in Normandy or elsewhere, from this point of the war onward, they were extremely vulnerable to Allied fighter bombers. And of course, they were in Normandy too. From an Allied perspective, I think there's a kind of dual failure in terms of the preparation for the Normandy invasion and thereafter. Failure one is an inability to grasp the incredible effectiveness of aimed, called in, accurate naval fire, except under improvisation, like at Omaha Beach and elsewhere. And in that, they hadn't looked at lessons from the Pacific Theater, unfortunately. And also, I think, weirdly enough, same deal with the hedgerows, because yes, they knew they were there, but they didn't quite appreciate the kind of combined arms training and tactics they were going to need in order to get through that kind of terrain, which you might say some Allied units had to deal with in the jungle in the Pacific, So some of that would have applied to Normandy as well.
So it looks like we have one last question from Mark Festoso from Virginia, and he writes, how much did Ike's injured knee affect him in the time leading up to Operation Market Garden?
Oh, I'd love to take that if I can.
Sure.
Dramatically. I mentioned earlier, that he's kind of out of touch with his advancing units that are not half a continent away, but at least a country away at that point. And one of the reasons is because he does not have physical mobility, because he's had this accident helping his pilot push the plane out of the sand and the muck, you know. And the other thing too is I think there were mines nearby that could have blown up and changed history forever. But leaving that aside, yeah, Eisenhower was immobile at that stage. And in fact, when he does finally meet with Montgomery on the tarmac, at the Brussels airport in September 10th, 1944, Eisenhower could not leave the plane because his knee was hurt so badly. So yeah, and of course in the days and weeks thereafter, there weren't too many ways he could get to the front and get a sense of what was going on. So I think certainly that did nothing good for the Allies.
We actually had two questions pop up that I didn't see earlier. My apologies. We have one from Bob Schwartz from Missouri. He writes, Dr. Lengel asked earlier what the Germans thought of Eisenhower. What did they know of him? What did what they know of him affect their defensive strategies for the remainder of the war?
I think that's did what they know of him affect their defensive
Thank
strategies
you.
is what was intended there. Also a good question. I mean, so far as I understand it, and I haven't studied the German side of this campaign too intensely, but I do think that the Battle of the Bulge, or what we called it, the Ardennes offensive, was at least in part based on Hitler's assessment of Eisenhower's slow reaction time. And also Hitler thought that he could exploit divisions between the Americans and the British. That's so far as my knowledge of it goes.
Well, yeah, no question. Absolutely no question. The Germans constantly, especially Hitler, have this kind of defensive offensive mentality. And so in a way, Market Garden is actually what led to the Bulge, because when Market Garden happened, it's at that point that Hitler decides he's going to launch this, big surprise counteroffensive. So he's sort of reacting to Eisenhower in that respect too. And yes, he certainly didn't think that Eisenhower would be able to react as quickly as he did once the offensive did happen. And in some respects, the Bulge is one of Eisenhower's finest moments, because he recognizes, I think, before even many of his commanders do, what is actually happening. And he takes some serious steps, which turn out to be the exact correct steps, to get troops in place to have a counterattack, an Allied counteroffensive of his own. Otherwise, it's possible the Germans might have advanced farther. Who knows?
I guess the Battle of the Bulge was not Omar Bradley's finest moment, because he had been warned of that and dismissed it, right?
Certainly. He had left the Ardennes front, very thinly defended, which is understandable because he has a manpower problem at that point, and you can't be strong everywhere. And he figures the terrain is going to do some of my defending for me, and that certainly makes sense. But where I think the failure is in not necessarily taking seriously that the Germans were massing and building on that front, because he's got good intel to the effect that they are. And so he probably should have been a little bit more curious as to why that was and to prepare for that. And of course, when it does happen, he doesn't react to it as quickly as he should. And I believe personally, he lets Courtney Hodges kind of drift into ineffectiveness along the northern shoulder. And all that just tends to make the Bulge worse than it may have otherwise been.
So we did get a couple more questions. Jackie Gillespie writes, would you be willing to discuss Eisenhower's reluctance to integrate the Army and his eventual decision to integrate select units during and after the Bulge? Once he agreed to it, was he glad that he did?
I would love to take that. Absolutely. I mean, Eisenhower was somebody who did not want to rock the boat. And so in that sense, I think I might say really almost shamefully, in retrospect, he, like almost every other white general, is really just fixated on winning this war operationally and doesn't want to take on any kind of social issue. And so they're just willing to keep on keeping on. We had serious racial tension problems in the U.S. Army on the run up to D-Day. There's riots that had happened. There's deaths. There's things like that are happening as a kind of subculture And Eisenhower is not necessarily taking steps to try and bring about the social change that we would want in retrospect. Now, the bulge sort of relieves them of that luxury now. You got to throw anybody you can into the mix to deal with this crisis. And so they begin experimenting with partial integration. In other words, what you'd have is you'd have an African-American rifle platoon fighting alongside a white rifle platoon. And eventually, these are very effective units. And so this is one of the things that leads to ultimate change. So I think Eisenhower, in any fair measure, would have said, yes, that was a good decision. But I think he was always kind of ambivalent on this issue of race throughout much of his life. He's prodded along later on in his life by Brown versus Board of Education and of course, the events in Little Rock and whatever. So I don't think we could ever think of him as someone who really took the lead in terms of racial progression. But at least he does come around to making what we would view as better decisions in terms of integration, but only under duress.
Keep in mind that I agree with everything you say, John, but I'd also say, keep in mind that Eisenhower came of age as an officer during the First World War. And there, if any, I would argue, there has never been a more profoundly racist environment in the U.S. military than there was during the First World War. It was absolutely overwhelming. And a number of generals, not Eisenhower, but others during the First World War, believed that events in that war had, quote unquote, proven that black men couldn't fight. They cherry-picked a number of episodes, particularly relating to the 92nd Division, which really were the fault of undertrained, poorly trained white officers rather than the African-American enlisted men who had to fight under them. And they used these to justify an argument that the Army should never be integrated, that African never be given the opportunity to fight, that they were only useful in labor battalions and the like. And so that was the military culture. That was the orthodoxy in 1918. That's what Eisenhower was taught. And I think, given that fact, and certainly we'd look back, we would like Eisenhower to have been more visionary than he was, at a certain time. But I think on the whole, he was probably much more progressive than most of his fellow officers, and he was against the grain, certainly toward the latter part of World War II, and then in the post-World War II period. I think he was ahead of the curve of most military-trained Americans at that time in terms of their treatment of African Americans and their recognition of African Americans' not only ability to fight with incredible bravery, but also their willingness and desire to fight. So, I just think it's important to keep that in some context.
Well, before we sign off, I'd like to tell you guys about some upcoming programs. Troy, if you could put that slide up, I'd appreciate it. We have our next Evening at Ease program scheduled for June 9th. Erin Miller will be joining us. Her grandmother served as a WASP in World War II, and her grandmother's dying wish was to be buried at Arlington National Cemetery. And Erin's book is over the series of events that had to occur for her grandmother to be buried at Arlington. So that's Tuesday the 9th at 7. It'll be on this Google platform. And you can go to our Facebook page or our website to get those links. Our next program in partnership with the National World War II Museum will be Thursday, June 11th at 2 p.m. It'll be similar to this program. However, we will have Craig Simons, Rob Citino, and William Snyder, and they will be discussing the D-Day plus, after D-Day, after the invasion, how did we continue to sustain the forward push? So again, you can check out our Facebook page or our website for the links. I'd also like to thank our donors and sponsors. Without the Eisenhower Foundation, of course, we could not do any of these programs. So my sincere gratitude goes out to the Eisenhower Foundation. And the Union Pacific Foundation has given sponsorship to the foundation, to the Eisenhower Foundation. to support these educational programs. So whenever you see anybody from the Eisenhower Foundation or Union Pacific Foundation, you thank them for me. So let's just go ahead and close and thank Dr. Lengel and Dr. McManus. Dr. McManus, I'm so sorry for the technical difficulties, but my goodness, what a trooper you were to join us.
My apologies for the difficulties. I'm glad I could participate in half it. I had a great time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And Tim, as usual, we couldn't do any of these programs without you. Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Dr. Lengel. Thanks, Dr. McManus.